The Russian campaign of 1812 was the beginning of the downfall of Napoleon. Napoleon was at the height of his power at that time, with his army, dubbed the Grande Armée, numbering around 600,000 men. The core of this army was well trained and equipped, being prepared for his planned invasion of England. Also, all the great powers of continental Europe were either his allies or client states, and half of the Grande Armée were comprised of troops from these allied nations. And yet this great army would be decimated from the Russian campaign. From 600,000 soldiers and hundreds of thousands of additional artillery, cavalry, and logistical train that followed, over 524,000 troops would perish. However, this campaign was not without its successes. Almost every battle was won, and Napoleon succeeded in capturing Moscow. And yet capturing Moscow did not bring Napoleon the peace he so desperately wanted. The Tsar from St. Petersburg still refused to give up and continued the fight, and Napoleon was forced to retreat west and subsequently lost what remained of his army to the brutal Russian winter. But you might be wondering, what if Napoleon went north instead and captured St. Petersburg? Would the Tsar have capitulated if he was driven from his capital? Would Napoleon even need to retreat after capturing the city, and therefore keep his army intact for the next campaign season? Today, we will discuss Napoleon's hypothetical decision to capture St. Petersburg, the effect this would have had on the Grande Armée, and the likelihood of ending the war with Russia upon the city's capture. You'd be surprised to know that Napoleon's ultimate goal during the Russian campaign of 1812 was in fact not the capture of Moscow. Neither Moscow, St. Petersburg, or any other Russian cities were the primary targets of the French invasion. Napoleon's main goal, when he crossed the Niemen River in June of 1812, was not to occupy Russian cities, but to destroy the Russian armies. However, throughout the beginning of the campaign, Napoleon kept his options open. In addition to chasing the retreating main Russian field army towards Moscow, it was intended that Oudinot's 2nd Corps and MacDonald's 10th Corps would destroy the Russian troops under the command of Wittgenstein to the north, which would have left the door to St. Petersburg open for the French advance. When Wittgenstein discovered this, he moved to intercept Oudinot before he could unite with MacDonald and defeated him at the Battle of Yakubovo, and again at the First Battle of Polotsk, causing 6,000 losses, forcing him to retreat. As it was, for the immediate period, the advance on St. Petersburg had to be abandoned, and so instead, Napoleon announced his intention to advance on Moscow. In an alternative timeline, Oudinot would join with MacDonald and crush Wittgenstein's army in the north, opening up the Grande Armée's advance to St. Petersburg. The march on St. Petersburg would commence in a similar way to Napoleon's march on Moscow, along with some caveats. The road to St. Petersburg from the Grande Armée's location, now at Vitebsk, during Oudinot's Battle of Polotsk, would mean that the Grande Armée would take even longer to reach St. Petersburg than it would have taken to fight its way to Moscow. However, this axis of advance would allow Napoleon to anchor his left flank to the Baltics and establish his line of communication through friendly territory. From Vitebsk, the Grande Armée would march north to Pskov, and from Pskov to St. Petersburg. One of the main issues on his march towards Moscow was that his extremely long line of communication deep within Russian territory, stretching for 800 kilometers, was extremely fragile and was constantly harassed and in danger of being cut by the Russians from both north and south. This time, his line of communication would be more secure, traversing friendlier territories from Königsberg to Riga and from there to Pskov. The supply lines, however, would still be overstretched and unable to sufficiently catch up with infantry columns on a forced march, and logistical issues would continue to plague the Grande Armée. His defeat of Wittgenstein and a change of direction north would also confound Russia's main armies to the east. Barclay de Tolly's First Army of the West, as well as Bagration's Second Western Army, which planned to fight delaying actions drawing Napoleon to the Russian interior, would now be completely out of position and would have to shadow the Grand Armée, force marching in order to cut off Napoleon before he reached Pskov. The march so far into the Russian interior was harsh on the army, and the effect on the Grand Armée's troops would be just as severe as if it were marching on Moscow. Contrary to popular belief, the majority of Napoleon's troops would either die or become ill during the summer heat and rain, not during the winter. Typhus, carried by lice which infested unwashed bodies in the seams of dirty clothing, had been endemic in Poland and Western Russia for years. Heat, rain, lack of water for washing, constant swamp-like conditions, troops packed together in large numbers at night, the hovels in which they sheltered, scratching irritable areas, not changing clothes, all were ideal conditions for spreading typhus. In the first weeks of the campaign alone, 6,000 men fell ill with it every day. By the third week of July, over 80,000 men had either died or were sick, at least 50,000 of them from typhus. Within a month of the start of the invasion, Napoleon had lost 1/5 of the men in his central army group. Typhus would severely deplete Napoleon's forces on its way to Pskov, and the army would have needed to regroup and receive reinforcements from the city before further striking north. This would give the Russians valuable time to further enact their scorched earth tactics and hinder the Grand Armée's efforts to live off the land. The replenished army would again continue its advance around sometime in September, running dangerously low of the year's campaign season. It would now have only 2 months to reach St. Petersburg before the first November snowfall and set up winter quarters, which Napoleon would hope to find supplies and shelter in the capital city. Fighting through stiffer resistance against the Russians, who now saw this northern advance as a greater obstacle to their plans, Napoleon would fight several minor engagements along his axis of advance towards St. Petersburg. Although now the situation was much more critical, the Russians would again try to avoid a major engagement that would allow Napoleon to pin their army, continuing to deplete their enemies while a strong defensive position would be prepared further to the north. But finally, 70 miles south of St. Petersburg, near the village of Rozdestveno, the Russians would turn to give battle. Napoleon would have a chance to win the decisive victory that he believed would end the war. The Battle of Rozdestveno would dwarf that of Smolensk and Borodino, exacting tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The battle would be bloody, with bayonet fighting in the streets of the village, and strong Russian fortifications and redoubts being stormed by French troops with devastating losses. However, the weight of the Grand Armée would eventually allow Napoleon to claim victory, forcing the Russian army to retreat yet again. Napoleon's victory during the Battle of Rozdestveno would almost certainly lead to the Tsar's abandonment of St. Petersburg in favor of Moscow. Although Napoleon would enter the city in triumph, assuming that the Russians' frantic evacuation and the Grand Armée's subsequent looting do not burn down the city as it did in Moscow, Napoleon would have immediately had to enter winter quarters. The overextended supply lines, although traversing through much friendlier territories this time, would have made the supplying of hundreds of thousands of troops in the city for many months nearly impossible. The countryside around the city would have been picked clean in the first few weeks, and the city supplies themselves, if not carried off or destroyed by the Russians, would have been woefully insufficient to sustain hundreds of thousands of troops and horses. Napoleon's entry into Moscow on the 15th of September allowed him some breathing room to send peace envoys to the Tsar, although the Tsar never responded, choosing to continue the war. In St. Petersburg, Napoleon would have no such luxury, and an almost immediate retreat would have been ordered toward Riga to wait out the winter. However, the retreat this time around would be far more forgiving for the Grand Armée than his retreat from Moscow. The daily low temperatures for the month of November in the Baltics fluctuates between 29 to 33 degrees Fahrenheit due to its proximity to the ocean, compared to a chilling 21 to 33 degrees for Moscow. The winter of 1812 was especially colder than usual, increasing the temperature disparity between the coast and the Russian interior. The forward situation would have also been better, as this area would be relatively untouched by the two armies and would be able to sustain the retreat south, although it would still be ruinous to the peasant population of the area. The comparatively warmer temperatures, coupled with the friendlier terrain, would have allowed the army to retreat in relatively good order, with manageable winter casualties, although significant reinforcements and resupply at Riga would still be required for the 1813 spring campaign season. Herein lies a critical failure in Napoleon's grand strategy that we begin to see at this time. He overestimated the importance of taking key cities to military operations. The capture of St. Petersburg would be one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dismal campaign that achieved relatively little for its efforts and the size of the army. But Napoleon did not possess the supplies to winter in the city, and there still was an extremely sizable Russian army in the field, albeit just as damaged as the Grand Armée. St. Petersburg would become something of a poison chalice for Napoleon. He would place great political stock in occupying it, but he could not keep it. Additionally, recent lessons should have shown him that occupation of a capital did not end wars. Neither the occupation of Madrid in 1808, nor that of Vienna in 1809 ended the wars there. Besides, the Tsar at this time was fully determined on continuing the war at all costs, and the vastness of Russia ensured that Napoleon would never be able to capture the Tsar, or decisively engage and destroy the Russian army. Napoleon's capture of St. Petersburg would have seen a similar turn of events to his decision to march on Moscow, but with a lower chance of ever actually reaching the city due to the time constraints. The Grand Armée's march north would have taken away considerable time from the already shortened campaign season, coupled with the increased distance to the objective and a stiffer resistance from the Russian army. And even with the capture of the city, the war would have continued, with the Tsar relocating to Moscow to continue the resistance. However, the milder winters and friendlier territories might have in turn saved Napoleon's army and his empire. A continuation of the war with his army intact would have signaled to the other great powers to remain compliant. And with the entire Baltic coast now closed off to the Tsar, it would have been harder for the Russians to receive vital aid from Britain to continue the war effort. The year 1813 might have even offered Napoleon a chance for the one decisive engagement he so desperately wanted, perhaps pushing the Tsar to open negotiations. In the end, we can only speculate as to what would have happened if Napoleon decided to go north. No matter what his successes and failures would have been, the situation around the rest of the empire was not encouraging. Britain was still at war with France. Spain was a quagmire draining French manpower and resources, and Prussia and Austria would sooner or later seek to avenge their humiliation at Austerlitz and Jena. War would continue to go on.